It was supposed to be just another quiet Tuesday morning. The kind Martha had come to appreciate in her later years, slow, unbothered, softened by the sound of Oregon rain tapping gently against her kitchen window. At 72, she had grown accustomed to a rhythm of solitude since her husband, George, passed away nearly 2 years before. She had her morning rituals, a cup of black tea, a wool shawl draped around her shoulders, and the old rocking chair by the window. That was her peace. That was her world, but that morning, everything changed. The phone rang once. Twice. She let it go to voicemail, as she often did these days. But something, a quiet unease, a pull, made her rise and check the message. A young man's voice, trembling and unsure, introduced himself. He said he believed George was his father, and he wanted to meet her. Martha stood in the kitchen holding the phone like it might burn her. The name, the tone, the message, it didn't make sense. 47 years of marriage. 47. She had shared everything with George, his laughter, his secrets, his storms. Or so she thought. It felt like the floor beneath her had shifted. As if a life she had carefully built, one she had trusted, had suddenly cracked wide open. But even then, no tears came. No screaming. No phone calls to her daughter. She just sat down in the rocking chair and listened. Not to the world, not to any voice outside, but to a stillness rising within her, deep and unfamiliar. In the days that followed, Martha found herself choosing silence. Not because she had nothing to say, but because words somehow felt too small. Too loud, too frantic. There was something beneath the surface she needed to touch, and it could not be reached by talking. In the space between her thoughts, something ancient and tender was beginning to stir. This is not just a story about betrayal, or aging, or secrets. This is a story about what happened when one woman stopped filling the air with explanations and began listening instead. Listening not just to the sound of rain or memory or regret, but to the quiet voice inside that had waited, patiently, her whole life to be heard. If you've ever felt silenced by life, by loss, by noise, by the chaos of what you can't control, this story is for you. Not because it offers easy answers, but because it shows what can happen when we stop looking outward for peace and begin the slow, quiet journey back inward. And if any part of this story touches something in you, we invite you to stay with us. Share this moment. Subscribe to our channel and walk with us a while. In this space, silence is not empty. It's full of truth, waiting to be heard. Chapter 1. The phone call that shattered the past. The phone call came just before noon, interrupting the quiet hum of Martha's kitchen. She had been rinsing dishes, her mind adrift somewhere between the smell of lemon soap and the gentle rhythm of water. Life had become slow since George passed, peaceful, even, in a way she hadn't expected. There were hard days, of course. The kind when loneliness wrapped around her like fog. But she had made peace with the silence, had come to find a sort of friendship in it. But that day, silence was shattered. The voice on the other end was young, too young. He sounded nervous, almost apologetic. "Mrs. Taylor," he said, his voice fragile, like it could break. "My name is Daniel. I think George Taylor might have been my father." There was a pause, the kind that seems to stretch time itself. Martha didn't respond. Couldn't. She stood there, the phone warm in her hand, her heart racing but her mind frozen, like someone had hit a switch and the world dimmed around her. She replayed the message 3 times before the words began to make sense. Daniel. George. Father. Her George, the man she had loved since she was 25. The man who brought her fresh lilies every Sunday and held her hand through 2 miscarriages. The man who built her a garden bench and painted it yellow because he said it reminded him of her smile. The man who whispered prayers with her before bed, who rubbed her back when her arthritis flared, who kissed her forehead every single morning for nearly 5 decades, that man had a secret. Martha sat down slowly, the chair beneath her creaking, as though it, too, was groaning under the weight of this truth. Her fingers trembled. She felt as though she had been dropped into a story she didn't recognize, one where she was no longer the wife, the partner, the keeper of shared memories. But a stranger looking in from the outside. It wasn't the fact that George might have had a son before they met. It wasn't even the betrayal of not being told. What shook Martha to her core was the question she could not ask: what else didn't I know? For a woman who had built her entire adult life on the belief in love, faithfulness, and mutual knowing. This revelation was more than shocking, it was unraveling. She thought of the little things, suddenly tinged with doubt. The business trip to Arizona that lasted an extra 2 days. The quiet look on George's face when they passed a boy who looked just a little like him. The letter she found once, addressed to someone named D, that he brushed off as old paperwork. She hadn't questioned him. She never felt she had to. Now she questioned everything, but what surprised her more than the betrayal, more than the confusion, was her response. She didn't scream. She didn't throw things or call her daughter or retreat into her bedroom like she might have done years ago. Instead, she found herself drawn to stillness. She sat in a rocking chair, placed the phone down gently, and stared out the window as rain began to fall again, tapping steadily against the glass. She breathed in and out. In the quiet, something deep began to stir. There was pain, yes, but it wasn't chaotic. It wasn't loud. It was old, ancient, almost like something she had always carried but never quite named. It pressed on her chest, not like a weight, but like a hand asking to be held. Martha didn't know what to do. She didn't know who Daniel really was or what he wanted. But in that moment, she knew what she didn't want. She didn't want noise. Not opinions, not assumptions, not even sympathy. She wanted space. She needed to hear what her heart was trying to say before the world drowned it out, and so she chose silence. Not the kind that shuts the world out, but the kind that lets something more sacred in. It would be the first of many moments where Martha would come to understand that silence, real, deliberate silence, isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of truth. And her truth was only just beginning to reveal itself. Chapter 2. The stillness that began to heal. The morning after the phone call, Martha awoke before the sun. She hadn't slept much, but strangely, she didn't feel tired. Instead, there was a kind of buzzing in her chest, not panic, not fear. Just a quiet urgency, like something inside her was asking to be noticed. She rose without turning on the lights, letting the blue-gray hush of dawn guide her through the house. The rain had stopped. Outside, the garden was soaked and glistening, each leaf heavy with what the night had left behind. In many ways, Martha felt the same. She sat in her old rocking chair, the one George had mended twice, the one that had survived decades of moves and memories. She held a blanket around her shoulders, not for the cold, but for comfort. The house was still. No footsteps. No voices. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the antique wall clock. That silence, once empty and aching, now felt different. It didn't demand anything from her. It allowed her to be exactly as she was, hurt, confused, unmoored. But still whole. Her eyes landed on a book on the shelf, one she hadn't touched in years. It was a worn paperback with a faded cover, the heart of the Buddhist teaching. George had bought it for her on a trip years ago, saying he'd heard an interview with a Vietnamese monk who made suffering sound like a doorway instead of a punishment. She hadn't given it much thought at the time. Life was too busy then. But now, her hand reached for it, almost without thinking. She flipped it open, and her eyes fell on a passage. When we are silent, we can hear the sound of the heart breaking and healing. Martha stared at those words for a long time. Something in them felt honest. Not comforting, exactly, but true. She closed the book and held it to her chest like it was a letter from someone she missed. Then, she sat a day. Not to pray. Not to meditate in any formal way. Just to be. It wasn't easy. The mind doesn't like silence when it's been running wild. Thoughts came quickly, some angry, some sorrowful, some simply questions with no answers. Why didn't he tell her? Did he ever plan to? What would her daughter think? Did she even want to meet this boy, no, this man, who claimed to be her late husband's son, but rather than push the thoughts away or spiral in them, Martha just watched them, like clouds drifting across a sky. Some stayed longer than others. Some brought thunder. But none stayed forever, and in that simple, uncomfortable quiet, something began to soften. Later that afternoon, as she reached for a sweater in George's old dresser, she found something she hadn't remembered placing there. Tucked beneath a stack of scarves was a sealed envelope. Her name, written in his unmistakable hand. She hesitated. Her breath caught in her throat. With trembling fingers, she opened it. The letter was dated nearly 6 years ago. It wasn't long, just a page. George's handwriting had always leaned slightly to the left, like he never wanted to take up too much space. He wrote about regret. About the choices he'd made before they met. About a child he had lost contact with and the fear he carried every day that telling her would undo the life they had built. He said he was sorry. That she deserved the truth. That he had failed in courage, but never in love. Martha wept, not loudly, but fully. The kind of crying that comes from a wound being touched gently, not torn open. She didn't feel absolution in his words, but she felt something else, a reminder that people are complicated and love is never perfect. It bends. It hides. But it also remains. For the first time in days, she stood up and walked to the kitchen window. The sky had cleared. A beam of light spilled across the garden bench where George once sat to trim his bonsai trees. Everything looked the same. And yet, everything had changed. She made herself a cup of tea. The kettle hissed, the steam curled. She carried it back to her chair, placed the letter on the side table, and sat again in silence, but this time, the silence didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a path. The stillness didn't answer her questions. It didn't remove the pain. But it made space for both. And that was enough, for now. Chapter 3. Listening to the heart's whisper. In the days that followed, Martha moved through her home with a tenderness she hadn't known she was capable of. Every object, every corner, seemed to hum with memory. The dining table where George used to read the newspaper now sat quiet under the weight of silence. The garden path that once carried their Sunday morning walks was overgrown, untouched since spring. Yet nothing called out for fixing. Instead, everything invited her to simply notice. And so she did. Each morning, she returned to the rocking chair with her tea and her thoughts. She didn't set a timer or follow any strict practice. She just Saturday. Sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes longer. The quiet was not always comfortable. But it was real. And in that raw stillness, she began to feel something she hadn't felt in years, a whisper, almost imperceptible, just beneath the noise of her mind. A whisper not from the world around her, but from within. One morning, while the rain tapped gently on the windows, Martha picked up an old leather journal she had kept in a drawer for over a decade. It was mostly empty, its pages yellowed with time. She held it in her lap, unsure of what to write. And then, without planning, her hand began to move. Not to record facts or lists, but to speak to herself. The words were not neat or clever. But they were honest. "I don't know who I am without him," she wrote. "But I think I'm supposed to find out." That sentence sat on the page like a mirror. Over the next weeks, her journaling became a morning ritual, not unlike prayer. She wrote about the silence, about the ache, about her fear of facing the years ahead alone. But gradually, other things surfaced too, memories long buried, fragments of joy, fragments of longing. One entry surprised her more than the rest. When I was 16, I wanted to be a painter. She stared at that line, as if it had been written by someone else. And in a way, it had. That girl, the one with ink-stained fingers and a sketchbook hidden under her bed, had been gone for a long time. Life, marriage, motherhood, and duty had taken her away. Not against her will, exactly, but gently, over time. Dreams often fade. Not in fire, but in forgetfulness. That afternoon, Martha opened the linen closet and dug through boxes until she found what she was looking for. An old wooden art box, given to her by her high school art teacher. Inside, the watercolor pans were cracked, brushes stiff, but it was all still there. Still waiting, she carried the box to the kitchen table, opened a clean page in her journal, and began to sketch. Her hand shook. Her lines were hesitant. But as the color touched paper, something opened inside her, a soft crack, like thawing ice. She wasn't painting for anyone else. There was no goal. No need to impress or prove. It was just her, the brush, and the quiet voice she had nearly forgotten, and in that moment, silence stopped being heavy. It became sacred. Each brushstroke was like a conversation with a part of her that had waited decades to be heard. She painted her garden, her rocking chair, her teacup. She painted a small bonsai tree, remembering how George used to care for his, pruning it delicately, speaking to it as though it could feel. She even painted a scene from a dream she'd had as a girl, a wide field of lavender with a sky so blue it hurt to look at. I in the stillness, she began to hear not just her sadness, but her joy. Not just her grief, but her longing. And slowly, it dawned on her, the heart always speaks. It always has. But most of us have forgotten how to listen. Martha didn't need answers anymore. She didn't need to understand every choice George had made, or how things could have been different. What she needed was what she had found: permission to come home to herself. To sit in silence. To let the heart speak in whispers and paint and ink. To remember that she was still becoming. Even now, the silence had not filled the space George left behind. It had simply helped her see that the space was his all along. Chapter 4. Meeting the boy. The decision to meet him didn't come quickly. For weeks, Martha kept Daniel's number tucked inside her journal, folded between 2 pages filled with words she hadn't been brave enough to say out loud. She read the number often, as if memorizing it might somehow prepare her for the unknown that it carried. There was a part of her that still felt frozen, caught somewhere between disbelief and a quiet ache she couldn't name. Yet, beneath the hesitation, something else was growing. Not urgency. Not obligation. Something gentler. Curiosity. And maybe even a strange kind of grace. It was early autumn when she finally called. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled. Daniel answered on the second ring. His voice was softer than she remembered, more cautious. He didn't ask questions. He didn't press. He simply said, "Thank you," as though the call itself was more than he expected. They agreed to meet the following Sunday at a small cafe near the edge of town. A quiet place, tucked behind a grove of trees, where the world felt slower. Somehow, like it, too, had paused to breathe. That morning, Martha dressed with more care than usual. Not out of vanity, but reverence. This was not just a meeting, it was a crossing. A crossing into a story she didn't write, but one that had been written all the same. As she drove, the silence in the car felt different than it used to. Not heavy, not sharp. It felt open. She wasn't sure what would happen. But she no longer needed certainty to step forward. When she arrived, he was already there. sitting on the patio, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. He looked nothing like George, and yet something in the way he held his hands, the slope of his shoulders, familiar, like a memory glimpsed in a dream. He stood when he saw her, unsure whether to smile, to reach out. She offered a nod, a small smile, and sat across from him. There were no dramatic reunions, no rehearsed speeches. Just the clinking of silverware, the distant sound of leaves rustling in the wind. And then, gently, words came. Daniel spoke quietly, telling her what little he knew. That he'd been raised by his mother alone. That she'd told him about George only after his death. That he wasn't searching for anything specific, just a connection, a thread to something real. Martha listened. Not just to his words, but to the spaces between them. The pauses that carried fear, hope, apology. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush. She let him unfold at his own pace. And in that silence, something remarkable happened. She felt her own story loosening. The grip of grief, the sharp edge of betrayal, they began to soften, not because they vanished, but because they were being held in something wider than pain, understanding. He reached into a small paper bag and placed something on the table between them. A tiny bonsai tree, its leaves trembling gently in the breeze. My mom said he used to care for these. I thought maybe it might belong with you. Martha stared at the tree. It was so much like the one George had tended in their backyard. She remembered watching him prune it, his hands slow and precise, as though each cut mattered. She reached out, touched the edge of a leaf, and for a long moment, said nothing. Then she looked up at Daniel. He loved them, she said. Said they taught him how to be patient. He nodded, eyes glistening, and looked away. They sat like that, side by side in a quiet neither of them fully understood. No resolutions, no rewriting of the past. Just two people, bound by someone they both knew in different ways, sharing the same sun and silence. As they parted, Daniel offered a gentle hug. Martha hesitated, then stepped into it. His arms were unfamiliar, but the gesture felt ancient. Like something that had waited years to be received. On the drive home, the bonsai sat beside her on the passenger seat, its roots wrapped in damp cloth. She glanced at it now and then, thinking not of the betrayal or the confusion, but of the tenderness she saw in Daniel's eyes. The same tenderness she had once seen in George's, all those years ago. That evening, she placed the bonsai on the windowsill near her rocking chair. Outside, the sky blushed with the last light of day. She sat in silence, not because she lacked words, but because no words were needed. Some truths are not explained. They are felt. And some healing does not arrive in answers, but in the quiet presence of another human being saying, simply, I am here. Chapter 5. A new life in quiet colors. The seasons changed slowly, as they always did in Oregon. Summer's sharp greens softened into the muted golds and coppers of fall. The air turned crisp, and the days grew shorter. Inside her small home, Martha, too, was changing, though not in a way that anyone passing by would notice. Her steps were no quicker, her hair no less silver, but something beneath the surface had shifted. The silence that once sat like a heavy stone on her chest had become something else entirely. It had become a companion. Each morning, she moved through her rituals with intention. She would wake before the light, wrap herself in her old blue cardigan, and sit by the window with a cup of tea. The bonsai Daniel had given her stood nearby, a quiet witness to the unfolding of each day. She had learned how to tend to it, not with precision, but with presence. Trimming, watering, observing, each task was an offering, not just to the tree, but to the stillness that now shaped her life. Martha painted again, not for an audience, but because her soul asked her to. What began as light sketches in her journal had grown into a small collection of watercolor pieces, soft images of her garden, the hills beyond her home, the bonsai, and even one of her own hand holding a teacup in morning light. There was a gentleness in her art, not polished or perfect, but full of breath. She called it quiet color. These paintings weren't trying to tell a story. They simply revealed what she saw when she slowed down enough to really look. One afternoon, while reorganizing a box in the attic, she found a faded envelope filled with photos she had taken years ago. Among them were pictures of her daughter as a child, of George smiling beside a grill, of Martha herself in her 30s holding a paintbrush, her hair pulled back with a scarf. She stared at that photo longer than the rest. There was something in her expression, a fierceness, a clarity, that she had forgotten. It wasn't gone, though. It had simply been waiting beneath the noise. Without quite knowing why, she selected a few of her watercolor pieces, placed them gently into frames, and brought them to the local library where she had once volunteered. The woman behind the desk recognized her. "These are yours?" she asked, surprised. "They are beautiful." Martha smiled, a little shyly. "They are quiet," she said. "But sometimes quiet things need to be seen too." The paintings were placed in the corner reading room, just below a tall window that caught the afternoon sun. Martha visited once a week, not to be noticed, but to sit on the worn couch across the room and watch as people passed by them. Some paused. Some didn't. But every time someone stopped, even for a second, something inside her warmed, not pride, exactly, but presence. A confirmation that she was still here, still creating, still connected. Her relationship with Daniel grew in gentle ways. They met once a month for lunch, shared emails about books and life. He asked questions not about George, but about her. What she loved. What she remembered. One day he brought his own child, a curious little girl with George's eyes and her father's quiet manner. Martha sat beside her in the park, watching her gather leaves, and felt an unexpected peace wash over her. Not because the past had been rewritten, but because she no longer needed it to be. At night, before sleep, she would light a single candle and sit for a few minutes in silence. Not to pray, not to meditate in any formal sense, but simply to be still. She no longer feared silence. In fact, she cherished it. It had become her sanctuary, her teacher, her guide. It reminded her, daily, that life is not always about answers or certainty or resolution. Sometimes it is simply about listening to the heart, to the breath, to the soft unfolding of each moment. She had not returned to the woman she was before the phone call. That woman was gone. But in her place stood someone fuller, more honest, more alive in her solitude than she had ever been in company. Her life was no longer built around noise or expectation, but on presence. On slow mornings. On still afternoons. On quiet colors and the whispered truths they carried, and that, she realized one evening as the wind moved through the trees outside her window, was more than enough. It was a life. Her life. And it was beautiful. Martha's journey didn't end in dramatic closure or grand revelations. There was no final confrontation, no miraculous reconciliation that tied everything neatly together. What she found was something quieter, something deeper, a way of being. That didn't require the world to change in order for her to find peace. The silence that once filled her home with echoes of loss had become a space she now cherished, a place where she could finally hear the voice that had been buried beneath decades of devotion, responsibility, and the quiet sacrifices that often come with love. She had always believed healing had to come through words, through conversations, apologies, explanations. But what she learned, sitting alone in a rocking chair, holding a warm cup of tea as the sky faded from gold to deep indigo, was that healing often begins where the talking ends. It begins in the stillness, in the breath we take before the next step, in the willingness to listen to what is uncomfortable, unresolved, and true. There were moments when the past crept in, the memory of George's laughter, the pang of betrayal, the echo of what could have been. But even those memories, once sharp and jarring, had softened. She no longer fought them. She welcomed them like old friends, knowing they were part of her story, but not the whole of it. What had changed most of all was not the story itself. But how she chose to hold it, she had discovered, in her own quiet way, what so many seekers have found through the teachings of Buddhism, that silence is not absence, but presence. It is the space where truth becomes audible. It is where we stop performing for the world and finally show up for ourselves. In silence, Martha met herself again, not the wife, not the mother, not the grieving widow, but the woman beneath all of it. The one who still dreamed, still created, still longed for color and connection. The one who had been waiting all along, and maybe that's what this story is really about. Not just about betrayal, or aging, or letting go, but about returning to the self, to the breath, to the present moment. About the quiet power that comes when we stop searching for answers and begin creating space for what is. Martha found that space in silence. And in doing so, she found herself. If this story speaks to something in you, take a moment today to turn down the volume of the world. Step outside, or sit by a window, or simply close your eyes and breathe. Let the silence come. Let it teach you. Let it hold you. You don't need to have all the answers. You just need to be willing to listen, and if this story brought you comfort, reflection, or a sense of calm, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Share it with someone who might need a quiet place to rest their heart. Leave a comment, tell us your thoughts, your silence, your journey. Together, let's continue to make space for truth, for stillness, and for the quiet beauty of simply being.